And now the pleasure and the honor to welcome on stage Paul-Olivier Dehaye. It's easy if you sit here. No, yeah, you need
the clicker.
Remote.
Thank you.
Is it easier if you're there or here?
Here.
Good. Paul-Olivier, everybody knows you because you've been in front of the British and European Parliament. You contributed notably in the investigation of the Facebook and Cambridge Analytica scandal. I hope it's not as difficult to be talking here in front of the audience in the EPFL than in front of the European Parliament, or you'll survive it.
Yes.
You survived the British Parliament and the European Parliament?
Yes.
Okay. You're a mathematician, you're an advocate for protection of personal data. You are based in Geneva, where you are the founder of personaldata.io, and that organization focuses on data protection, of course. You're also the founder of My Data Global and My Data Geneva. We've been talking about the way now all the scientific community, not only, of course, in medicine, but everywhere, are focusing on COVID-19. Since the coronavirus has entered our daily lives, we've been more and more acquainted with new words, with new concepts, such as tracing contact, such as virus, of course, such as spreading the virus, clusters groups. And of course, this is quite an inspiring analogy for you as a mathematician and as someone that is very interested in data and the way that data can be traced. So I think you're going to use to start off this analogy with all these new words coming from the way we try to fight now the epidemic situation. And of course, I'll ask you a few questions about that. So,
yeah. So actually, what happened is that already during the Cambridge Analytica scandal, I was thinking very much about circulation of information over networks and what could be done about this. So this idea of disinformation, how would someone with a negative intent use data to influence populations? And to the extent that back in January, just before COVID, in before COVID times, I was giving a talk about disinformation in a big cybersecurity audience with a bunch of generals. And I had developed this idea that a very good analogy was in biology. But what I was saying was, well, let's all remember high school and thinking about cells and thinking about organisms, how information passes around. But it turns out that just a month or two later, we started talking about us as organisms circulating in a big network and information as DNA jumping from one of us to the other. So there is a lot of analogy, but actually there is more than just an analogy. There is real math, there is a real framework behind this. So that's what I want to start with here, is explain a little bit of the work that contact tracers are doing right now to try to understand the virus and how to most effectively try to limit its propagation, which the goal should be pretty clear. So this is actual data, but from the Canton Geneva, but with filters to make sure that it's a non-representative sample, that it's anonymized, that there's noise added. There's all kinds of things that have been done. But what I will say about it is still representative and still, I don't think it is misleading. It's not completely real data, but what I'll say is not misleading either. So what you see here, I need to give you a quick chart to understand this. In taupe, in brown, those rounds are people, all right? And you see two types, small ones and big ones. The small ones are infected. The big ones are, we don't know. They're not being tested right now, but they're sitting in quarantine somewhere. Or they were at the time this slide was made. And between any two people, take two brown dots, in between there is some very colorful dot. And this is a common contact or a common context for them to interact. So in purple, you see, those are social contacts. I know this, I'm just telling you quickly. In blue, light blue, it's unknown. In green or dark green, it's more related to work. And those smaller blue dots are co-residents, people who live together. All right? And so you see that there are indeed clusters that are forming, like here at the bottom. You see that there is a bunch of people. Of course, this is a partial view. The contact tracers don't know everything about how the virus propagated. So that's interesting. What's also interesting is what happens there at the top. You see this big dot surrounded by 3 others of different colors. So this person is really unlucky because they have 3 different reasons to be in quarantine at the moment. Right? So they have 3 different types of contacts, one at work, one social contact, and then one that is unqualified, empty data if you want, but there is a contact with someone who is infected. But they themselves are not known to be infected. So the most rational explanation, and this might show you how this could be useful, is that this person is actually asymptomatic, but is infected as well. They're just not being tested at the moment. So why am I... Oh, and another important element is this purple dot surrounded by a black box. This is slightly different. It's a bit like those co-working, co-living environments. It's contexts that involve multiple people. So this is actually a party that has been recorded through the Koga app that is relevant in Geneva, that is used in Geneva. So in a sense, there are 2 types of common contexts. There's a friendship context on a social network, and then there's belonging to a group kind of relationship where multiple people are in the same situation. Now, what's the link with fake news? Well, we have a very partial view. We don't understand enough about COVID at the moment. But this is a much more global view that is coming out of Brazil, and that shows what actually, how you should think about it actually. You should think about the propagation of COVID when you actually have substantial amounts of data. And you see that there are those clusters there with philanderous connections with other clusters, right? I ask you to compose a graph randomly, like truly randomly, it's not going to look like that. This is really exceptional among the set of all possible graphs. So why is this? Why is there this particular pattern? Well, it turns out that COVID has some specific characteristics that are also relevant in the fake news context, and I'll explain that the relevance in a second. But we know that there are super spreader events. We know that suddenly some people, for unknown reasons at the moment, will infect 10, 15 other people. It's less said, but we also know that some people infect no one. They are infected, but they don't infect anyone. So that the average is 3 people or something like that. So there is an enormous amount of variance around those 3, and we don't really know why. The analogy is, for fake news, some content will have enormous propagation despite being false, and we don't really know why. Right? But this hints at techniques that could be used to actually recover or fight back this epidemic of either COVID or fake news, which is to trace the origin. Because if you do that, then you gain more and more information about you walk back in time with the virus and you bias your search towards instances where those clusters might have occurred. So the analogy on social networks fighting disinformation is to always work really hard at finding the source, but also at understanding what information is actually missing so that you can do that more effectively and you can optimize the processes in order to fight disinformation. So on the left, you have this abstract view of contacts. On the right, you have these contacts placed through GPS on a map. So I want to say a little bit more about how this data was produced, because I think it's interesting and somewhat unfortunately relevant to this audience. So this data is GPS data that comes through what's called an SDK, so a software development kit that is integrated in apps. In Brazil, this company Grandata that is collecting, in this case, precise profiling data about individuals, GPS data that allows enough precision. GPS is not very precise, but it allows enough precision to know who is in contact with whom. And on top, this is correlated with anonymous health data, meaning health data released by a public authority in order to further research, I think. But researchers are able to align the two and to figure out where the clusters actually are. Now, I said this was unfortunately relevant because actually, if you investigate, and this is kind of what I do with volunteers that I want to actually thank today here, if you investigate a little bit this ecosystem of data collection, you realize that a lot of apps from the Groupe Ringier are actually collecting this GPS data as well. So they're collecting this GPS data through an intermediary called InLoco, which is also in Brazil, which is tied to other actors. And I've been very vocal against SwissCovid, against the application SwissCovid. This is the kind of things that worries me. There are actors in this room or in the Groupe Ringier that actually collect data that could be used, that would be very relevant against the epidemic. Maybe that's desirable or not. There are Bluetooth beacons being sent around for SwissCovid that are the equivalent of this anonymous health data. But we have no real control over this. We don't really know who in this ecosystem might be using this. And so this is the jump that I'm making with SwissCovid of why I'm opposing in certain ways. One of the reasons why I'm opposing its use.
Just before we go back to the different examples you gave and the analogy about SwissCovid, there's probably a main or central question is the end, that is the goal of SwissCovid. If you compare it to a way we want to collect data in the Cambridge Analytica scandal, for example, had bad reasons for it. Here, we know that SwissCovid has an aim to help us fight COVID-19. So, does the means justify?
Yeah. So I'm not advocating for huge centralization of data either. So I wrote an op-ed in Le Monde opposing the French way, which was very centralizing. The initial title was COVID Analytica, because the parallel was extremely clear there that this was the same strategy. SwissCovid has a different strategy. It's much more making an attempt at not centralizing data. But I would argue that it has also built a false enemy in the Swiss state that is trying to collect this data potentially to help in the epidemic context, reduced the problem to just that one, simplified it with partly an engineering mindset and set out to solve the simplified problem. But it doesn't take into account at all this ecosystem of commercial surveillance. It just considers state surveillance as a danger. But there is that ecosystem of commercial surveillance. So the risk is not zero. And that risk should be balanced.
But it's not intentionally.
No, it's not intentionally. It has to be said, though. There is a risk that I would argue there is a risk. I'm not saying it's intentional. Good. Right. But this has to be balanced against utility. Right? So is SwissCovid potentially helpful? And that's another question. And if I may, I will use the analogy of fake news and its circulation and all of that. It's a question of, do you want to try to convince people that in their direct relationship with each other, there should be some form of mediation, however distant, by a state intermediary, because we don't want fake news to propagate? Or do you actually want to concentrate on groups where this disinformation circulates, or contexts that are leading to this additional propagation? And I think it's actually the second answer. And the response is pretty clear in the context of the epidemic. It's in Geneva, clubs have been closed for a while because this is a place where increased propagation could occur, right? So what's the response? Well, the response is to be very serious about the data collection. Is this big tool, the big round thing that we have at the top. If there is an event, we should be able very quickly to find everyone. So you were saying, today we registered, we came, we entered our name, so this data will be destroyed in 14 days. Great, I have no reason not to believe it, but the real question to me, having talked to the contact tracers in Geneva, is also, how quickly can they get to this data? Because it has to be really good, really well done for them to be able to reach out in time to this data. And the problem that I see now is that, at least in Geneva, I don't know how it's in Vaud, in Geneva, the clubs have an obligation of collecting data very well. The Geneva Canton has paid for an app that helps clubs to do it for free, all of that, great. But if you go to gyms, if you go to this and that, it becomes a mess. You know, it's sheets of paper where people introduce, like, I'm James Bond, my number is 077, and so 007, and so on. So it's complete junk. And that's a problem because when the contact tracers make this reasoning about where could there have been a super spreading event, they're investing time. They're investing time thinking about it. And if they find this event, they show up to the person and say, no, give us the list. And they realize this list is junk. This is a huge loss of resources for them. Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So the tracing is not as efficient as it should be.
The tracing is not as efficient. It hasn't been explained to people why it's important. And so it's not taken seriously.
Well, let's go back, if you mind, to the analogy with fake news.
Yeah, sure.
Are they fake news super spreaders? As they are COVID super spreaders. They don't have the real symptoms. You can't identify them straight away, but they do spread. How do you identify the super spreaders in fake news?
So I think, like the virus, there are environments that are more conducive to mutual repeated inoculations or something like this. So there are those bubbles where people progressively get steered towards a certain way of thinking. And then they behave like you see here. There is those.
So you can identify a cluster the same way.
There's a cluster where people mutually infect each other with ideas that are completely crazy, and then they just spread slowly and philanderously, like philanders, like long tails or whatever you want to call it, into other groups where this information will propagate again. We know this pattern, actually. We know it. If you look at the autism and vaccine misinformation, well, we're going to see that merge very, very quickly with completely other different conspiracy theories. We're going to see those clusters find each other and just progressively go into a bigger and bigger space of misinformation. I mean, if you look at some of I'm against the current way Swiss COVID is being deployed, but if you look at some other people who are against it, they also have beliefs that are just completely insane, simply said. But this becomes a big umbrella because people don't really understand this thing, and they're trying to make sense, and from the echo chambers they have, they make a certain sense of the world.
So that means that tracing, as you said before, again, analogy, time is playing against us, and we're not always tracing the more efficiently possible. So we've got loads of projects, and we're going to discover them, that are trying to trace and proposing solution in tracing. Are we good at it today? Do we have a model? Do we know how we trace fake news in these clusters? How we can find them easily?
Right. So I'm sorry, I'll have to again take an example from COVID because I think it helps. So Gaël Hurliman, who is the vice redacteur,
web rédacteur en chef of the Temps.
Right. So he just said on Twitter he had been infected, and he's now in isolation, I guess. So I talked to him a little bit on Twitter and tried to figure out exactly. And it turns out that he knows a huge amount of things about the potential setting where he got infected, just because he knows that last weekend he did nothing and so on. So just because of that, actually, he's very helpful to put some kind of causal relationship between the events around him. That's a main problem with COVID, is you don't have a causal relationship, because I could infect you, but you would have symptoms before I do. And that means you have this graph here in the end where you don't have any arrows. You don't know which direction it goes in, right? So with Gaël, that's different. It's quite likely that from his situation, we could infer who infected him, right? So this causal link is crucial. And for fake news, it is actually what we should strive for. This is the common framework to understand things, is can we infer causation in the propagation of information? So in some ways, it's a lot easier, because if you look at some Facebook post that reaches you, you know who posted it, it's there, right? But what you don't know is the exact path that it has followed. You might know the person before because you see this person reshared, but you don't know the person before that, right? So you cannot trace the whole thing. It just lands on your Facebook feed, comes out of nowhere. You know the source, you know the last step, but you don't have any clue about the intermediary. So that's exactly the place where we should try to see methodologically, really step by step, what is the exact information we need in order to be able to understand more. And it's crucial that we do this work ahead of time, so we can have a concerted demand, not just a polite request, but a concerted demand from platforms. This is the information that we need in order to better understand the propagation of news. The alternative is we just say, there is a fake news problem, and we get Mark Zuckerberg who says, don't worry, we'll fix it. I don't think that dynamic really works. Up to people.
Yeah, up to people to decide, but I think we would all agree. Does it mean there can be an analogy on the question of the vaccine? We're all waiting for the vaccine for COVID. Would there be a vaccine for fake news, or is that the end of the comparison and we will have to stop to the tracing analogy, really, when it comes to fake news?
I think we should much more focus on the process to live with fake news, to live with COVID. So what are the processes we need to have in place in order to mitigate, contain, all of that vocabulary, the virus or the fake news propagation? So, and that would mean, in my view, this whole process of, okay, there's new disinformation patterns. What are they? What is the information we need to us make sense of this and not leave that knowledge exclusively to the platforms?
That means we have to rely on individual responsibility.
There is an element of that. So I think there is an element of that. Yes, because you were asking me, are there super spreader of fake news? There could be super spreaders, like you see in Finland and in some other countries, of counter fake news. People who take it as their responsibility to actually fact check in a distributed way, right? And who are it's explained to them based on rational, measured arguments. These are good tactics to fight against fake news. You could even imagine short-circuiting like certain steps by reaching out to influencers to explain, to be the vaccine in a sense, by their own behavior.
Counter the data, the wrong data, yeah.
Right, so watch out, you are quite an influencer, you have propagated disinformation and so on. These are the exact patterns that it follows. Partly because, it's not going to reach to them directly, probably, but their environment, people around them, around those influencers, some of them will understand this better, will see the role they're playing in society and will try to shape them as well.
So again, we can conclude that we're not very optimistic in stopping fake news and eliminating it completely from our networks, but we have to learn to live with it, and we have to learn, find ways of tracing it and fighting it, being able to counter it by spreading other information, right information.
Yep.
We only have a few minutes, but probably people that are conducting the projects we're going to discover more in detail in a while. Probably there would be some questions you would have liked to ask now to Paul-Olivier. Would you agree on that?
Yes.
I know there's a microphone somewhere. Est-ce que quelqu'un... it's there, sorry. Of course, you'll be all able to be networking informally and talking together later on, but is there one question that wants to be addressed now? If not, let's take the projects, and then you'll probably discuss with Paul-Olivier later on. Thank you ever so much to have been with us and for your speech. Thank you.
Thank you.